Hey folks, Alan Saunders joined by Nick Farabaugh once again for another episode of Draft Talk on Pittsburgh Sports Live. Nick and I are doing these every day during the month of April leading up to the 2021 NFL Draft to supplement our coverage at SteelersNow.com. And Nick, today we're going to talk about tight ends. And the Steelers obviously have a big need at that position after the retirement of Vance McDonald. And it's a position they've been paying some pretty significant attention to in the pre-draft process. Who are some of the big names out there that you think the Steelers could be interested in? And maybe we'll talk about where in the draft it makes sense for them to target a tight end.
Yeah, well, I mean, the biggest name that everyone's going to want them to go, they're going to want to go 2 hours, 3 hours into the state of Pennsylvania to State College, obviously, after Pat Freiermuth. I mean, he's the guy that they showed a lot of interest in at Penn State. Alfredo Roberts was there. He worked him out. I mean, Freiermuth, after the entire thing, I mean, he said that he's had many conversations with him, Tomlin, Colbert. That organization has really been clamoring after Pat Freiermuth. Ferocious blocker, was injured this year, so, I think people forget a little bit of what Freiermuth brings to the table. But he's the big guy to watch. He's a sleeper pick at 24, although I think he's more likely 155 or a trade back scenario. And then the other guy that I think really is looking likely is Tommy Tremble out of Notre Dame. They were there at the pro day. Tremble was a guy that is just a phenomenal blocker, probably the best blocker in the draft at the tight end position. And he's more than athletic enough to also have upside in the receiving game. And then the last guy that I'm thinking of, you saw him in Mobile. He put on a show. Trey Mckinney out of Georgia. I think that fit is really nice for both sides. He's a pretty polished blocker. Showed what he could do against SEC talent this year in that regard. While he's not a proven receiver at the college level. I think at the Senior Bowl, he really showed off his ability to run a lot of routes, make a lot of great catches, and have upside in that area as well. So those are the three main guys I think that when you look at tight end that they're probably most interested in.
Yeah, I thought McKinney had the best catch of the Senior Bowl as a tight end. And in addition, he just looked really good. You mentioned blocking when talking about all three of those guys. Obviously, Vance McDonald was the Steelers' blocking tight end. They've still got Eric Ebron, who's not a blocker, to be kind. Do you feel like that is, an essential part? They're going to get a tight end. They're not going to get another guy that's like Ebron, that is a receiver first and a blocker second.
I do feel like they want someone who at least knows how to block. But I also feel like when you look at Freiermuth, Tremble, McKinney, even the guys other guys they've shown interest in, like Kenny Yeboah, Nick Eubanks, guys like that, they're not bad as receivers, right? Like Vance McDonald at the end of his career was a good blocker, but it was almost non-existent in the passing game. He essentially became Matt Spaeth. So I think what they're looking for actually is a good thing. I think they're looking for a little bit more of an athletic tight end, maybe a guy other than Freiermuth. I think both Tremble and McKinney have upside as receivers, although they haven't proven they're great receivers. But those are two guys that you can see being really good tight end twos and even becoming tight end ones because they're athletic, so they can do both. So I think the Steelers are trying to look at maybe more of a complete tight end. Rather than, just a strict blocking tight end. But all three of those guys are huge blockers. And I think the loss of Vance McDonald is something people really aren't talking about enough in the running game when it comes to that. I mean, some of the best running games they had were because Vance McDonald was very, very key and instrumental in opening up a lot of holes off tackle. So I think Vance McDonald's loss is definitely something they're trying to fill. The question is, obviously, with other needs, they might not be able to do it super early, but if the value is right, I definitely think they're looking to replace that early.
Right now, I mean, with Ebron in the fold, this isn't a quote unquote starting need, I guess. But the Steelers did play a good bit at two tight end last year. And after Ebron, it's Zach Gentry and Kevin Rader, who I actually thought had a pretty good game against Cleveland in Week 17. But those are not two guys with a ton of experience. Gentry coming off an injury. Where would you rank this in terms of the Steelers' needs? How important is it for them to get a second quality tight end to go with Ebron?
I mean, it's very important. I don't think it's as pressing as something like corner, like running back, like center. And even tackle, I think, is bigger. But I think tight end, you can probably slot tight end in the same tier as like linebacker, edge, somewhere around there. Probably guard as well. In there, I think tight ends in that same tier. I mean, they have no depth at tight end. I mean, Zach Gentry is probably a tight end 3, at best. He's not going to be a guy you're going to rely a ton upon. So it's a need. It's a need, and they need one for the future.
Yeah, Ebron's entering the final year of his contract, so whoever gets drafted this year, if it's a high draft pick anyway, should be not only expected to play alongside him this year, would in theory at least be in line for a starting role. You talked about Freiermuth a good bit, and I want to go back to him because he's one of the number of guys that I see in this draft as like kind of a reach for 24, but probably won't, more likely than not, to not be there at 55 and fits one of the Steelers' needs. I know we talked about trading down, but is this another one of those guys that just seems like his spot should be between the Steelers' first 2 picks?
Yeah, probably. I mean, listen, the tight end needs throughout the league. I don't think they're super plentiful. I think a lot of teams are going to go for more tackles, centers, attack the corner depth because it is a deep corner class. Take some of these linebackers, um, take some of these receivers where it's deep. But Frymuth's a guy that you can conceivably see him just falling in between those two landing spots. Like it's hard to see him going to 55. Again, he didn't do much at his pro day outside of just the drills, dealing with an injury. But even with that, I mean, it's a bad tight end class. And Frymuth is unquestionably, especially after Brevin Jordan's pro day. I think this affects this. Brevin Jordan didn't really have a great pro day, didn't test very well. And I think that pushed Frymuth up the board even more. And he really heightened the gap between him and Brevin Jordan. And I think that really is going to make Frymuth's stock go much higher, especially since we're going to have probably a 40 plus, a possible 40 plus pick gap between Kyle Pitts and the next guy. So I definitely think Frymuth is sitting in that range of probably 35 to 50. And I think that's where it'll go.
Yeah, you mentioned Jordan. He's another guy that I think could be on the radar, maybe not as good of a blocker as the other guys you named. How about Hunter Long from Boston College? I was really impressed with his game when I was up there for Pitt last fall. Where do you see him going, and is he a potential fit for the Steelers?
I think Hunter Long's very interesting. I think Long has a chance to be the third tight end off the board. After again, Brevin Jordan, I think his stock is going down. Because this is a guy that is 6'3" and wins on athleticism, and he didn't test very athletic. Now, obviously, it's not going to bump him down a ton, but it's going to bump him down probably half a round, and that's going to be enough, especially with Long's very good pro day and already good tape. Because yes, Long is very fluid as an athlete. He wins the catch point consistently. Now he's not I don't think he's an outstanding blocker, but I definitely think he's more than capable in that area. And while he doesn't get, a great amount of movement like a Tommy Tremble, like a Pat Frymuth at times, I do think that Long is a guy that loses slowly, and that's really all you need from your tight end. In both the running game and the passing game, it doesn't always have to be flashy. And I think Long is a mismatch guy. You can flex out into the slot, flex out wide. He's got a nice route tree. He's been worked there at H-back, at the Y. He's worked all over the field. And I thought Phil Jerkovich really took a liking to him as a safety blanket, a guy that could find the soft spot in zones. And I know Ben Roethlisberger always loves a guy like that that he can go to and rely on. So I think Hunter Long's definitely a fit there, maybe at 87.
Yeah, Kenny Yeboah is another guy you mentioned. Maybe not as good of a blocker as some of those other guys. I thought he had a really good Senior Bowl out of Ole Miss, transferred from Temple, and is another sort of big athlete that maybe you could project a little bit more to than what he's shown in the college game.
Yeah, Yeboah is interesting because I think at the beginning of the year, this was the guy we were talking about, perhaps usurping Freiermuth as the tight end too. Then he kind of died down a little bit towards the end of the year. Didn't have a lot of production, but you know that Kenny Yeboah is a guy that is an athletic mismatch up the seam. He's a seam buster at heart and can break it at any time. because he's a much more explosive athlete than most of the other guys in this class that the Steelers are interested in. So he's closer to Ebron than he is McDonald. I'll say that if they get Yeboah, which actually does give them very interesting possibilities with Kenny Yeboah out of 12 personnel. If they decide to use it, that's a lot of athleticism and size that you would have to cover over the middle of the field. And that's not even counting what Juju Smith-Schuster or Chase Claypool could do out of that. So I think Yeboah is very interesting. And I also don't think he's a horrible blocker. I mean, I thought he's a very willing blocker. And I thought he was much better than Eric Ebron as a blocker. I mean, right away, Eric Ebron, very willing as a blocker, just doesn't know what to do at all with his hands. I thought Yeboah knew what to do with his hands. He's got a little bit of aggression and a mean streak behind him, and he can get some movement at times. So, he's an inconsistent blocker, but I definitely think he's a much better blocker than Ebron and has more upside in that area as well.
The last thing I want to touch on is the Steelers are getting a new position coach at this group. You mentioned Alfredo Roberts being at the Penn State Pro Day working with Freiermuth. He came from Los Angeles, where, a pretty notable tight end roamed the field last season in Henry. What if anything, do you expect the Steelers to do differently with their tight ends with Alfredo Roberts than they did with James Daniel?
Well, I do find it interesting that they hired him from Anthony Lynn's scheme, because we know Anthony Lynn, and this is a scheme thing. We know Anthony Lynn is more of a wide zone guy, so I do find that interesting. Maybe the Steelers, we've seen hints to this. Chris Morgan is also a wide zone guy from the Shanahan tree. I do wonder if the Steelers are moving towards more wide zone this year, so I think that could be possible. Where they're not looking for a dominant blocker, because Ebron is never going to be a dominant blocker. So maybe they're just going to ask him to hold his place and let the running back do what they need to do. As far as what they did last year in LA with Alfredo Roberts, it was that they used every single possibility they could with these tight ends. They moved them all over the field. I would expect to see Ebron out wide more this year. Because I didn't think we saw him a ton out wide. I thought we saw him a lot in the slot and inline. I expect to see him less inline this year, especially if they get one early, like a Pat Freiermuth. I expect them to try to keep Ebron off the line of scrimmage, off the tackle. Just move him out. This is a guy that should probably be strictly a receiver, and I feel like Ebron is going to be used as such this year, just a big weapon, and he's going to be moved out wide. I also think they did this with all their tight ends, so down 1 through 3. So you can see whoever they draft probably move around the formation as well. As far as other formations they could add, I do kind of wonder what we're going to see in terms of that H-back role. Like the Steelers didn't do a ton of H-back stuff, but Alfredo Roberts did. Matt Canada definitely does a lot of stuff with an H-back. So I wonder what that can mean for someone like a Derek Watt. Someone like Tommy Tremble fits beautifully into that role. So I definitely think you can see maybe more of an H-back role. Maybe get Ben Roethlisberger a bit more of a safety blanket out of that as well. So I think there's a few possibilities you could see with Roberts coming from what he did in Los Angeles.
Yeah, and talking about Canada's H-backs, Jalen Samuels, of course, did that exact role for him at NC State. Good stuff, Nick. I think we covered the tight ends about as in-depthly as we can, and we'll get to some new topics when we get back together on Wednesday. If there's something specific you'd like us to talk about, go ahead and leave a comment, and we'll try to get to it as soon as we can. And I think the corners are probably where we're going to go next. That's what we've been talking about in our off-air chats. And so we'll get that to you on Wednesday, and we'll continue with this every weekday the month of April, leading up to the 2021 NFL Draft. For Nick Farabaugh, I'm Alan Saunders. Thanks for watching Draft Talk again, and have a great day.